The thunder rolled across the distant mountains as Rose Lambert stared at her bruised reflection in the small, cracked mirror. Her left eye could barely open, swollen shut from the beating Walter had given her the night before. Her split lip tasted of copper, and the purple bruises across her cheekbone testified to her husband's unrestrained fury. This was Medicine Bow, Wyoming in 1878, a place where a woman's suffering behind closed doors remained her own private hell. Rose dabbed a damp cloth against her face, wincing at the contact. The cool water did little to ease the throbbing pain, but she needed to look presentable enough to fetch supplies from town. Walter had left at dawn, riding out with his ranch hands to mend fences along the northern edge of their property. He wouldn't return until sundown, giving her precious hours of solitude. She practiced the explanation she would give for her injuries: a fall from the porch steps, an accident while churning butter stories. She had rehearsed so many times over the past 3 years of her marriage that they flowed from her tongue with disturbing ease. At 22, Rose had already mastered the art of disguising her husband's cruelty. The Lambert ranch sat 2 miles outside Medicine Bow, a modest spread that Walter had inherited from his father. What had once seemed like a blessing marriage to a landowner when Rose had nothing to her name had become her prison. Walter's charming courtship had dissolved into drunken rages not long after the wedding, his promises of gentle affection replaced by iron fists and vicious words. Rose pulled a shawl around her shoulders and tied a bonnet over her auburn hair, the wide brim casting her damaged face in shadow. She hitched the wagon herself, her fingers working deftly despite their trembling. The familiar movements calmed her, reminded her that she still possessed some measure of strength, despite everything Walter had taken from her. The road into Medicine Bow was rutted from recent rains, jostling the wagon and sending spikes of pain through Rose's battered body. Still, the openness of the Wyoming plains soothed her spirit. Out here, beneath the vast blue sky, she could pretend that freedom was more than a distant dream. Medicine Bow had grown considerably since the railroad had come through. What had once been little more than a way station was now a proper town with a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, and even a small church. Rose guided her wagon down the main street, her eyes downcast, bracing herself for the inevitable questions her appearance would provoke. She tied her horse at the hitching post outside Henderson's general store, taking a deep breath before climbing down from the wagon. Her ribs ached with each movement, another hidden reminder of Walter's rage. "Morning, Mrs. Lambert," said George Henderson as the bell above the door announced her arrival. His jovial expression faltered when he caught sight of her face. "Good heavens, what happened to you?" "Took a nasty fall off the porch," Rose replied, the lie coming easily. "My own clumsiness, I'm afraid." George's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. This wasn't the first time Rose had appeared in his store bearing suspicious injuries. "What can I help you with today?" he asked, mercifully changing the subject. Rose handed him her list. "Just the usual supplies. And some thread if you have it. I've torn Walter's good shirt and need to mend it before he notices." As George gathered her items, the bell above the door jingled again. Rose kept her face turned away, but she could feel the presence of whoever had entered something solid and sure that seemed to fill the small store. "Be with you in a moment, Mr. Reed," George called over his shoulder. Rose risked a glance and found herself looking at a man she had never seen before. He stood tall in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking much of the morning light. Dust covered his dark clothes, speaking of long days on the trail. A weathered cowboy hat sat low on his forehead, but not low enough to hide eyes that were startlingly blue against his sun-bronzed skin. Those eyes met hers, and Rose quickly looked away, but not before she saw the flash of something in his gaze, concern, perhaps, or anger. She couldn't be sure. "Take your time, George," the stranger said, his voice deep and smooth like well-aged whiskey. "I'm in no hurry." Rose felt his eyes on her, assessing her battered face despite her efforts to hide it. Heat crept into her cheeks, shame and humiliation washing over her in equal measure. "That'll be $2.16, Mrs. Lambert," George said, placing her wrapped parcels on the counter. Rose fumbled with her coin purse, her trembling fingers struggling with the clasp. "Allow me," came the stranger's voice, suddenly closer than she expected. He laid $3 on the counter. "This should cover the lady's purchases and mine as well." "That's not necessary," Rose protested weakly, finally managing to open her purse. "I insist," he said, and now she could see his face clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' stubble. But it was the kindness in his expression that caught her off guard. There was no pity there, only a controlled anger that somehow wasn't directed at her. "I don't accept charity from strangers, sir," Rose said, forcing steel into her voice. A slight smile touched his lips. "Ethan Reid," he said, extending his hand. "There, now I'm not a stranger." Despite herself, Rose felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "Rose Lambert," she replied, briefly touching his hand before withdrawing her own. "A pleasure, Mrs. Lambert, though I'm sorry for the circumstances." His eyes flicked to her bruised face, then away, respecting her dignity. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Reid, but I can manage my own expenses." She placed her coins on the counter, aware of how the simple act of refusing his help felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. Ethan nodded, respecting her decision. He collected his own purchases, tobacco, coffee, and ammunition, while Rose gathered her parcels. The store suddenly felt too small, too intimate, and she needed to escape the intensity of this stranger's gaze. "Good day, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Reid." Rose hurried toward the door, her parcels clutched to her chest. "Mrs. Lambert," Ethan called after her, his voice halting her at the threshold. "If you ever need assistance, I'm staying at the Wayfarers Inn. Room 7. Rose didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his words, but she felt them settle somewhere in her chest. A small ember of possibility in the darkness of her existence. She was halfway to her wagon when she heard the commotion behind her shouts and the sudden thunder of hooves. Her heart leapt to her throat as she recognized the rider, Walter. He dismounted in a fluid motion, his face already darkened with rage. At 35, Walter Lambert was still a handsome man, with thick brown hair and sharp features, but alcohol and anger had begun to carve harsh lines around his mouth and eyes. "What are you doing in town?" he demanded, grabbing Rose's arm hard enough to bruise. "I told you to stay at the ranch today. We needed supplies," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd save you the trouble." "Making a spectacle of yourself, you mean," Walter hissed, his eyes taking in her bruised face. "Parading around for everyone to see, making me look like some kind of monster." Rose could feel the stares of passers-by, their discomfort at witnessing this marital discord in public. Most would look away, pretend they hadn't seen. A husband's treatment of his wife wasn't for outsiders to judge. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words automatic now. "I didn't think. That's your problem, isn't it? You don't think." His fingers dug deeper into her flesh. "Get in the wagon. We're going home." "I believe the lady was just leaving," came Ethan's voice from behind them. He stood in the doorway of the general store, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. Walter turned, releasing Rose's arm to face this new threat. This is between me and my wife, stranger. I suggest you mind your own business." When a man handles a woman that way in public, he makes it everyone's business, Ethan replied, stepping into the street. He was taller than Walter by several inches, his frame solid with muscle earned through years of hard work. Walter's hand twitched toward the gun at his hip. "You calling me out? Just suggesting you might want to reconsider your approach." Ethan's voice remained calm, but Rose could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness in his stance. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Rose saw uncertainty flicker in Walter's eyes. He was conscious of his reputation in town, aware that public opinion could turn against him if he pushed too far. "Rose, get in the wagon," Walter ordered, his voice slightly less aggressive now that he had an audience. "Yes, Walter." Rose moved toward the wagon, shame and relief battling within her. She climbed up onto the seat, arranging her parcels around her, avoiding the curious stares of the townspeople. Walter mounted his horse, casting one last venomous look at Ethan. "This isn't finished," he muttered before turning to Rose. "I'll be right behind you. Drive straight home." As Rose flicked the reins and the wagon began to move, she caught Ethan's eye. Something passed between them. A silent communication that Rose couldn't fully decipher, but that nonetheless lodged in her heart like a promise. The ride back to the ranch was tense with Walter following close behind, his presence a dark shadow at her back. Rose knew what awaited her at home. Walter's rage, temporarily contained in public, would erupt once they were behind closed doors. She gripped the reins tighter, wondering how much more her body could endure, how many more lies she could tell, how many more days she could survive. By the time they reached the Lambert ranch, clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a summer storm. The house loomed before them, a two-story wooden structure that had once seemed charming to Rose's younger self, but now represented only confinement. Walter dismounted before the wagon had fully stopped, striding toward the house without offering to help Rose with the supplies. She carefully climbed down, wincing as her bruised ribs protested the movement. She gathered as many parcels as she could carry, leaving the heavier items for a second trip. Inside, Walter had already poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. He drank it in one swallow, then poured another. Rose set her packages on the kitchen table, moving quietly, trying to make herself invisible. "Who was that man?" Walter asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I don't know," Rose replied truthfully. "A stranger passing through town. I'd never seen him before today." Yet he felt entitled to interfere between a man and his wife. Walter's glass hit the table with a sharp crack. "And you let him, standing there like some pitiful creature, inviting his sympathy." "I didn't ask for his help, Walter. I didn't want anyone to notice me at all." Rose began unpacking the supplies, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, trying not to provoke him further. "You made me look like a fool in front of the whole town," Walter said, his voice rising. "My own wife undermining me." "That wasn't my intention," Rose said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I only wanted to get supplies." Walter crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing her by the shoulders and forcing her to face him. "Don't lie to me," he growled. "I saw the way you looked at him. Like some whore begging for attention." Rose closed her eyes, bracing for the blow she knew was coming. But instead, Walter released her with a disgusted sound. "Clean yourself up," he ordered. "The Hendersons are coming for dinner tomorrow night, and I won't have you looking like that. I've told them you had an accident with the wagon. See that you don't contradict me." He grabbed his hat and headed for the door. "I'm going to check the south pasture. I'll be back for supper." The door slammed behind him and Rose sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. She had been granted a reprieve, but it was temporary at best. Walter's rage hadn't dissipated. It had merely been postponed. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the window panes. Rose rose shakily to her feet and returned to the wagon to bring in the rest of the supplies before the storm hit in earnest. As she lifted a sack of flour from the wagon bed, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. Frowning, she pulled it free. It wasn't part of her purchases, and she was certain it hadn't been there when she left town. Rose unfolded the note, her heart quickening as she read the hastily scrawled words. Mrs. Lambert, if things become unbearable, the Widow Parker's place at the edge of town offers sanctuary. She has helped others. Show her this note and she will assist you. E.R. Rose quickly refolded the paper and slipped it into her dress pocket, glancing around to ensure no one had seen. The implications of the note both terrified and exhilarated her. Here was proof that someone had seen her suffering, had acknowledged it, and had offered a path to escape. But escape to what? Rose had no money of her own, no family to turn to, nowhere to go beyond Medicine Bow. And Walter would never let her leave alive of that, she was certain. He had told her as much during his darkest rages, whispered promises of what would happen if she ever tried to run from him. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through Rose's shawl. She hurried the last of the supplies into the house, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. The note in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin, a dangerous secret, a forbidden hope. That night, as she prepared supper, Rose found herself watching the road through the kitchen window, half expecting to see Ethan Reed riding toward the ranch. The thought was both frightening and strangely compelling. What would she do if he came? What would Walter do? But the road remained empty except for the curtain of rain, and when Walter returned, soaked and in a fouler mood than when he'd left, Rose had hidden the note beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. It was her secret, her talisman, a reminder that somewhere in the world, someone had seen her pain and had not looked away. The next morning dawned clear after the storm, the Wyoming landscape washed clean, the distant mountains sharp against the blue sky. Rose rose early, as always, to prepare Walter's breakfast. Her face still bore the marks of his previous attack, but the swelling had subsided somewhat, allowing her to see from both eyes. Walter ate in silence, then announced he would be in town most of the day, settling business at the bank and meeting with cattle buyers. Remember, the Hendersons will be here at 7. Make sure everything is perfect. He cast a critical eye over her bruised face. And for God's sake, do something about your appearance. After he left, Rose threw herself into preparations for the dinner party. She baked bread and an apple pie, slaughtered and plucked a chicken, polished the good silver that had been Walter's mother's. The work was exhausting, especially in her weakened state, but it kept her mind from dwelling on the note hidden beneath the floorboard and the blue-eyed stranger who had written it. By mid-afternoon, she had done all she could to prepare for the evening. The house was clean, the food nearly ready, requiring only final preparation before serving. Rose decided to rest for an hour, knowing she would need her strength to maintain the facade of happy wife before the Hendersons. She had just settled onto the bed when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Thinking Walter had returned early, she hurried to the window, her heart sinking at the prospect of facing him sooner than expected. But it wasn't Walter's bay gelding coming up the drive. It was a dapple gray, and its rider wasn't her husband but Ethan Reed. Rose froze, uncertain what to do. What reason could Ethan have for coming to the ranch? And what would happen if Walter returned to find him here? She hurried downstairs and out onto the porch just as Ethan dismounted. He removed his hat when he saw her, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "Mrs. Lambert," he greeted her, his voice carrying across the yard. "Mr. Reed," she replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "My husband isn't here." "I know," Ethan said, approaching the porch. "I saw him in town. He seems occupied at Palmer's saloon for the time being." Rose's hands clutched at her skirts. "Then why are you here? It isn't proper for you to call when my husband is away." Ethan stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a respectful distance. "I came to make sure you were all right," he said simply. "After yesterday, I was concerned." "As you can see, I'm perfectly fine," Rose said, though they both knew it was a lie. "I appreciate your concern, but you should leave before someone sees you here." "Did you read my note?" Ethan asked, ignoring her dismissal. Rose glanced around nervously, half expecting to see Walter appearing on the horizon. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "But I can't accept your help, Mr. Reed. My situation is complicated." "It's not complicated at all," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "What your husband is doing to you is wrong. It's criminal, and it will only get worse." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes, and she blinked them back angrily. "You know nothing about my marriage, Mr. Reed." "I know the signs of a woman being beaten," Ethan replied, his blue eyes holding hers steadily. "I've seen it before. My own mother endured it for years at my father's hands." The simple statement stunned Rose into silence. She stared at him, seeing for the first time the personal pain behind his offer of help. "What happened to her?" she asked finally. A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "She died before she could get away from him. I was 14, too young to stop it, too old to ever forget it." He took a step closer, his expression intensely serious. "I couldn't save her, Mrs. Lambert, but I can help you if you'll let me." Rose felt as though the ground were shifting beneath her feet. Here was understanding without judgment, help without conditions. It was so unexpected, so foreign to her experience of the past 3 years, that she hardly knew how to respond. "My husband will kill me if I try to leave him," she said, voicing her deepest fear for the first time. "Not if we don't give him the chance," Ethan replied. "The widow Parker has connections with good people in Cheyenne. They can help you start a new life, far from here." "When?" The question escaped before Rose could consider it fully, born from a desperate hope she hadn't known she still possessed. "Tomorrow," Ethan said. "While your husband is in church, the widow will have a wagon ready behind the mercantile. I'll make sure you get to it safely." Rose's mind raced with the possibilities. Tomorrow, freedom, a new life. But the risks. "He'll come after me," she said. "He'll never let me go." "Let me worry about that," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "All you need to do is be ready. Pack only what you can carry easily: clothes, any money you can access, anything of value that's rightfully yours. Nothing he would immediately notice is missing." The sound of distant hoofbeats made them both tense. Ethan quickly backed away from the porch. "Tomorrow," he said urgently. 10 o'clock. Can you do it?" Rose hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes," she whispered, the single word both a promise and a prayer. Ethan mounted his horse in one fluid motion. "Stay safe tonight," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "And remember, you're not alone anymore." He rode away just as another rider appeared on the horizon, one of Walter's ranch hands returning early from his duties. Rose sagged against the porch post in relief, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the ranch hand would hear it when he approached. But he merely tipped his hat to her before leading his horse to the stable, leaving Rose alone with the weight of her decision and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that by this time tomorrow she would either be free or dead. The dinner with the Hendersons that evening was an exercise in deception. Rose served the meal with practiced grace, smiled at appropriate moments, and explained her fading bruises as the result of a fall from the wagon during the storm. If George Henderson's wife noticed how Rose flinched when Walter placed his hand on her shoulder, or how her laughter never reached her eyes, she gave no indication. Walter was at his charming best, regaling their guests with stories of his cattle operation and his plans to expand the ranch. He poured wine liberally and insisted on filling Rose's glass repeatedly, though she barely sipped from it. "My Rose is a treasure," Walter said at one point, his arm snaking around her waist in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture but was actually a warning grip. "I don't know what I'd do without her." Rose forced a smile, thinking that by this time tomorrow he would have to find out. After the Hendersons left, Walter, mellowed by wine and the success of the evening, retired to bed without incident. Rose cleaned the kitchen slowly, deliberately, using the time to consider what she would take with her tomorrow. The small amount of money she had managed to save from household expenses over the years was hidden in a jar of dried beans in the pantry. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to help her start over somewhere new. When she finally went upstairs, Walter was already snoring. Rose slid into bed beside him, keeping to the very edge, holding herself rigid to avoid any contact. Sleep eluded her for hours as her mind cycled through fears and hopes, doubts and desperate plans. What if Ethan didn't come? What if Walter discovered her intentions? What if she managed to escape but couldn't survive on her own? By the time dawn streaked the sky with pink and gold, Rose had made her peace with the risk. Even death would be preferable to spending another year, another month, another day as Walter Lambert's punching bag. Sunday morning rituals proceeded as normal. Rose prepared breakfast while Walter shaved. They ate in silence, Walter reviewing cattle ledgers while Rose stared out the window, memorizing the view of the mountains she had come to love despite everything else. "I expect you to be ready for church by 9:30, Walter said as he finished his coffee. "Wear the blue dress and your mother's brooch, and for God's sake, use powder on those bruises. They're still visible." "Yes, Walter," Rose replied, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. In less than 2 hours, she would either be on her way to freedom or facing the consequences of a failed escape. Walter left to check on a new calf in the barn, and Rose immediately went to work. She changed into her sturdiest traveling dress, forgetting the blue one Walter had specified. She packed a small carpet bag with essential clothing, her mother's locket, the money from the bean jar, and a daguerreotype of her parents. Everything else she left behind: the furniture she had polished so carefully, the curtains she had sewn, the china she had washed after every meal. None of it mattered now. She hid the carpet bag under the back porch, where she could retrieve it quickly on her way to the wagon. Then she returned to the kitchen, and for appearance's sake, began preparing a Sunday roast that she knew would never be cooked. At 9:15, Walter returned from the barn. "Why aren't you dressed?" he demanded, seeing her still in her everyday clothes. "I told you to wear the blue dress." "I'm sorry," Rose said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I lost track of time. I'll change now." Walter's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Rose was never late, never disobedient about such matters. "See that you do," he said. "We're leaving in 15 minutes. Rose hurried upstairs, her mind racing. She had planned to feign illness at the last minute to convince Walter to go to church without her. But his suspicion made that risky now. She might have to accompany him to church and then slip away somehow, but that would mean missing her rendezvous with Ethan and the widow. As she changed into the blue dress Walter had specified, her hands trembling with anxiety, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple horses, moving at speed. Walter's voice rose in question from downstairs, then in alarm. Rose ran to the window. 3 riders were approaching the ranch, the sheriff and 2 deputies. Behind them, at a more sedate pace, came a wagon driven by a woman Rose recognized as the widow Parker, and riding alongside the wagon, his face set with determination, was Ethan Reed. Rose flew downstairs just as Walter stepped out onto the porch to confront the approaching lawmen. "Sheriff Dawson," Walter said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What brings you out to my property on a Sunday morning?" Sheriff Dawson dismounted, his weathered face grim beneath his mustache. "Walter Lambert, I'm here on serious business. Step away from the house, please." "What is the meaning of this?" Walter demanded, not moving. Rose stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes darting from Walter to the sheriff to Ethan, who had now dismounted and stood beside the widow's wagon, watching the confrontation with intense focus. "I have sworn testimony from 2 witnesses who saw you assaulting your wife in town yesterday," the sheriff said. "And I have reason to believe it's not the first time." Walter's face darkened. "What I do with my wife is my own business, Sheriff. The law gives me the right to discipline her as I see fit." "The law gives you no right to beat her half to death," Sheriff Dawson replied, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered gun. "Now step away from the house." Walter's hand moved toward his own weapon. "You're overstepping, Sheriff. I suggest you and your men leave my property before this gets ugly." "Walter Lambert," the sheriff said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for assault and battery. Will you come peacefully?" Walter's response was to draw his gun with lightning speed. But the sheriff and his deputies were prepared. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Walter staggered back, his gun unfired in his hand, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto the dirt of the yard. Rose stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend the sudden, violent shift in her circumstances. Walter lay motionless, blood spreading across the back of his shirt. The sheriff and deputies approached him cautiously, weapons still drawn. "Mrs. Lambert," came Ethan's voice, cutting through her shock. He had moved to the bottom of the porch steps, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" The simple question broke through her paralysis. Rose stumbled forward, nearly falling down the steps in her haste. Ethan caught her, his strong arm steadying her. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the question. "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "He's gone." Rose looked back at Walter's body, feeling nothing but a vast, hollow relief. 3 years of terror and pain ended in an instant by 3 bullets. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I never wanted him dead." "I know," Ethan replied, his arm still supporting her, but he gave them no choice. The widow Parker approached, her kind face lined with sympathy. "Come, my dear," she said, taking Rose's cold hand in her warm one. "Let's get you away from here while the sheriff takes care of things." As if in a dream, Rose allowed herself to be led to the widow's wagon. Ethan helped her up onto the seat, his hands gentle but strong. "My bag," Rose said suddenly, remembering. "Under the back porch." Ethan retrieved it quickly, placing it in the wagon bed before mounting his own horse. The sheriff approached as the widow prepared to drive away. "Mrs. Lambert," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "I'm sorry it came to this. We'll need your statement, but it can wait until tomorrow. For now, go with Mrs. Parker. She'll look after you." Rose nodded numbly, still trying to absorb the reality that Walter was dead, that her planned escape had become unnecessary, that she was suddenly, unexpectedly free. As the wagon pulled away from the ranch, Rose looked back at the house that had been her prison for 3 years. Walter's body had already been covered with a blanket, the sheriff and deputies moving with the efficient solemnity of men accustomed to death. "How did you know?" she asked Ethan, who rode alongside the wagon. "About the sheriff, I mean. That wasn't our plan." I went to him last night, Ethan explained. Told him what I'd seen in town, what I suspected was happening. He said he'd had concerns about Walter for some time but needed a witness to come forward. He paused, his expression troubled. I never intended for him to die, Rose. I just wanted to give you a chance to get away safely while he was being questioned. You called me Rose, she said, oddly fixated on that detail amid everything else. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. I suppose I did. The widow's house was a neat cottage at the edge of town, its small garden bright with summer flowers. Inside, it was cozy and welcoming, with well-worn furniture and the scent of cinnamon and apples in the air. You'll stay with me for now, the widow told Rose firmly. Until you decide what you want to do next. Thank you, Rose said, the words inadequate for the enormity of her gratitude. Ethan stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. I should go, he said. The sheriff will want my statement about what happened. Rose felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving. He was the one solid thing in her suddenly altered world, the one person who had seen her suffering and had acted to end it. Will you come back? She asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice but unable to disguise it. If you want me to, Ethan replied, his blue eyes serious. I do, Rose said simply. After Ethan left, the widow helped Rose settle into a small, clean bedroom at the back of the house. She brought tea and toast, though Rose found she couldn't eat. The events of the morning kept replaying in her mind: Walter's fall, the blood spreading across his shirt, the sudden knowledge that he would never hurt her again. It's not wrong to feel relieved, the widow said perceptively, watching Rose's face. That doesn't make you responsible for his death. He chose his path when he decided to draw on the sheriff. I know, Rose said, though guilt still nagged at her. If she hadn't planned to leave, if Ethan hadn't gone to the sheriff, Walter would still be alive. Try to rest, the widow advised. Tomorrow will be difficult enough. The town will be buzzing with the news, and there will be questions to answer. But rest eluded Rose. As darkness fell, she sat by the window of her room, watching the stars appear one by one, marveling at the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing dinner for the Hendersons, enduring Walter's controlling presence, planning a desperate escape. Now she was a widow herself, free but adrift, uncertain what her future held. A soft knock at the front door broke her reverie. Rose heard the widow's footsteps, then the murmur of voices. A moment later, there was a gentle tap at her bedroom door. Rose, the widow called. Ethan Reid is here. He'd like to speak with you if you're feeling up to it. Rose smoothed her hair and straightened her dress before opening the door. Yes, I'll see him. Ethan stood in the widow's small parlor, still in the same clothes he'd worn earlier, though he'd clearly made an effort to clean up. His dark hair was damp, as if he'd just washed, and his face was freshly shaved. I hope I'm not intruding, he said as Rose entered the room. I wanted to let you know what the sheriff said. You're not intruding, Rose assured him, taking a seat on the sofa. The widow discreetly withdrew to the kitchen, leaving them alone. Ethan sat in a chair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The sheriff says it was a clear case of self-defense. Walter drew first, and 3 witnesses saw it. There won't be any charges against the deputies who fired. Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. There will be an inquest, of course, Ethan continued, but it's just a formality, and he hesitated, seeming unsure how to proceed. And what? Rose prompted. The ranch is yours now, Ethan said. Everything Walter owned passes to you as his widow. The sheriff said to tell you that his deputy will stand guard at the property tonight to ensure nothing is disturbed. The realization hit Rose with unexpected force. The ranch was hers. The house, the land, the cattle, all of it now belonged to her alone. After years of having nothing, of being entirely dependent on Walter's grudging provision, she was suddenly a woman of property. "I don't know if I can go back there," she confessed, the words torn from some deep place within her. "There are too many memories." "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Ethan said gently. "Or tomorrow or the next day. You have time now, Rose. Time to heal, time to consider your options. Why are you helping me?" Rose asked, the question that had been on her mind since he'd first intervened in town. "You don't know me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I told you about my mother," he said finally. "What I didn't tell you is that after she died, I swore I would never stand by and watch another woman suffer if I could prevent it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I saw you in town yesterday, with your face bruised and that look in your eyes, the same look my mother had for years, I couldn't walk away." "You risked your life," Rose said softly. "Walter could have shot you." "Some things are worth the risk," Ethan replied simply. In that moment, looking into his earnest face, Rose felt something shift inside her, a small, fragile feeling she had thought Walter had beaten out of her forever. Hope, perhaps, or the faint beginning of trust. "Will you stay in Medicine Bow?" she asked. "I hadn't planned to," Ethan admitted. "I was passing through on my way to Montana, looking for ranch work there." He hesitated, then added with a hint of a smile, "But I find I'm not in such a hurry to leave anymore." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Rose felt a blush rise to her cheeks and she looked down at her hands. "It's late," Ethan said, rising to his feet. "You need rest, but I'll come by tomorrow if that's all right. See if you need anything." "I'd like that," Rose said, standing as well. "And Ethan, thank you for everything." "Good night, Rose," he said softly, holding her gaze for a moment longer before taking his leave. After he was gone, Rose returned to her window, but now she looked out with different eyes. The stars seemed brighter somehow, the future less frightening. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine possibilities: running the ranch herself, or selling it and starting fresh somewhere else, or... She stopped that line of thought before it could fully form. It was too soon to be thinking of Ethan Reed in that way. Too soon after Walter's death. Too soon to trust her own judgment about men. And yet, the memory of Ethan's blue eyes, so full of concern and respect, lingered in her mind as she finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning brought the realities of Rose's new situation into sharp focus. The sheriff arrived at the widow's house early, needing her formal statement about Walter's death and the circumstances leading up to it. Rose sat at the widow's kitchen table, hands clasped tightly around a cup of coffee, and told her story: the years of abuse, the escalating violence, the confrontation in town that Ethan had witnessed. She spoke haltingly at first, then with growing strength as the sheriff listened without judgment, his pencil scratching across his notebook as he recorded her words. "Mrs. Lambert," he said when she had finished, "I want you to know that many of us in town suspected what was happening. We should have acted sooner, and for that, I am truly sorry." Rose nodded, accepting his apology without absolving him. The collective blind eye the town had turned to her suffering was a conversation for another day. "What happens now?" she asked. "There will be a funeral," the sheriff replied. "Typically day after tomorrow, and the inquest will be held next week. After that, the ranch and everything else will be legally yours to do with as you see fit." After the sheriff left, the widow suggested Rose might want to visit the ranch to collect more of her personal belongings. "I'll go with you," she offered. "You shouldn't have to face that house alone." But when they arrived at the ranch in the widow's wagon, they found Ethan already there, speaking with the deputy who had guarded the property overnight. He came to help Rose down from the wagon, his warm hands briefly encircling her waist. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I thought I could help with any heavy lifting." Rose was surprised at how grateful she felt for his presence, how much easier it was to approach the house with him beside her. Inside, everything was as she had left it the day before, Walter's coffee cup still on the table, the Sunday roast still uncooked in the kitchen, the blue dress she had changed out of flung across the bed. With the widow and Ethan's help, Rose packed more of her clothing, her few books, and some personal items she hadn't been able to fit in the carpet bag. They worked in a comfortable rhythm, the widow organizing, Ethan carrying, Rose directing them to the things that mattered to her. As they worked, Rose found herself watching Ethan, the careful way he handled her belongings, the respectful manner in which he entered and exited rooms, asking permission before opening drawers or closets. It was so different from Walter's proprietary attitude, his assumption that everything in the house, including Rose herself, belonged to him to use or abuse as he pleased. By midday, they had packed everything Rose wanted to take back to the widow's house. The rest, furniture, kitchenware, Walter's clothing and personal effects, could wait until she decided what to do with the ranch. As they prepared to leave, Rose took one last look around the house. It seemed smaller somehow, less threatening now that Walter was gone. Still, she couldn't imagine ever feeling comfortable here again. Too many corners held memories of pain, too many rooms echoed with the sound of Walter's raised voice or striking hand. "I think I'll sell it," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "The ranch, I mean. I don't want to live here again." The widow nodded approvingly. "A fresh start might be just what you need, my dear." "There will be buyers," Ethan added. "It's good land, well situated. You should get a fair price." Back at the widow's house, over a simple lunch of bread and soup, Rose continued to consider her options. "I could go to Cheyenne," she mused, "or Denver perhaps, somewhere bigger than Medicine Bow where no one knows me or my history." "You could," the widow agreed, "but don't be too hasty. Give yourself time to heal before making such decisions." Ethan had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Whatever you decide, Rose, you don't have to do it alone." The implication of his words warmed something deep inside her, but Rose was cautious. Her experience with Walter had taught her the danger of rushing into relationships, of believing too quickly in promises of care and protection. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your friendship means a great deal to me." If Ethan was disappointed by her careful response, he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled and changed the subject, telling them about his travels across the Western Territories, the sights he'd seen, the work he'd done on various ranches. His stories were engaging, occasionally funny, and painted a picture of a man who valued hard work, honesty, and independence, qualities Rose had come to appreciate. As the days passed, Rose fell into a routine at the widow's house. She helped with cooking and cleaning, finding comfort in simple domestic tasks, freed from the fear of Walter's criticism. The widow, whose first name was Margaret, proved to be a kind and understanding companion, offering advice when asked, but mostly giving Rose the space she needed to process her grief and confusion. Walter's funeral was a small affair. Few people in Medicine Bow mourned him genuinely, though many attended out of respect for Rose or simple curiosity. She stood dry-eyed beside the grave, wearing a black dress borrowed from Margaret, feeling neither sorrow nor triumph, only a profound relief that this chapter of her life was truly closed. Ethan stood beside her throughout the service, a solid, reassuring presence. He had bought a new black suit for the occasion, and though he looked uncomfortable in the formal attire, Rose appreciated the gesture of respect. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly as they walked back toward town after the burial. Yes, Rose replied truthfully. I feel free. The inquest into Walter's death was held the following week, as promised. Rose testified about the events leading up to the shooting, as did Ethan and the sheriff. The verdict was swift and unsurprising: justifiable homicide in self-defense. Walter Lambert had drawn his weapon on officers of the law and had paid the price for his actions. With the legal matters settled, Rose turned her attention to the ranch. She placed an advertisement in the territorial newspaper, offering the property for sale. Within days, she had 3 potential buyers, all eager to inspect the land and make offers. Ethan accompanied her to these meetings, his knowledge of ranching proving invaluable as he helped her evaluate the offers and negotiate terms. By the end of the month, she had accepted a fair price from a family moving west from Pennsylvania, eager to establish themselves in the cattle business. You've done well, Ethan told her as they rode back to town after signing the final papers. That's a good price for the land, and the Millers seem like decent folk. They'll take good care of the place. Rose nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders as they crested the hill that gave them a last view of the ranch. I'm glad it's going to a family, she said. They'll make better memories there than I did. With the sale of the ranch complete and the money safely deposited in the bank, Rose found herself at a crossroads. She had enough funds to go anywhere, start any kind of life she chose. Margaret had encouraged her to take her time deciding, to perhaps travel a bit before settling down. Ethan, too, seemed to be at a point of decision. His planned journey to Montana had been indefinitely postponed, but he had taken temporary work at the livery stable in town, earning his keep while maintaining a respectful distance from Rose, visiting her and Margaret several times a week, but never presuming upon their growing friendship. One evening in late September, as the first hints of autumn colored the cottonwoods along the creek, Rose invited Ethan to join her for a walk. The air was crisp, the sunset painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink. I've made a decision, Rose said as they strolled along the creek bank, just far enough apart that their hands didn't touch. About where you'll go? Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Rose nodded. I'm going to stay in Medicine Bow, at least for now. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her with surprise and something like hope in his blue eyes. You're staying? Yes, Rose said, meeting his gaze steadily. I've rented a small house on Elm Street. Mrs. Henderson is selling me some furniture at a very reasonable price, and I'll be moved in by the end of the week. What changed your mind? Ethan asked. I thought you wanted to make a fresh start somewhere else. Rose smiled, the expression coming more easily to her these days. I realized I've already made my fresh start right here. I'm not Walter Lambert's wife anymore. I'm just Rose with my own money, my own house, and my own choices to make. Ethan nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. I'm glad, he said simply. Medicine Bow would be a poorer place without you. They resumed walking, and this time their hands brushed occasionally, the contact brief but electrifying. Rose found herself thinking how different this was from her courtship with Walter, the slow, respectful way Ethan was allowing their relationship to develop, the absence of pressure or expectation. What about you? She asked after a comfortable silence. Will you still go to Montana? Ethan considered the question, his expression thoughtful. I don't think so, he said finally. I'm finding I like Medicine Bow more and more. His eyes met hers, and the message in them was clear. Besides, the livery owner has offered to sell me a partnership in the business. It's good, steady work. Rose felt a flutter in her chest at his words. That sounds like a fine opportunity, she said, unable to keep a note of pleasure from her voice. As October turned the landscape golden and brought the first dustings of snow to the distant mountains, Rose settled into her new home and her new life. She had furnished the small house simply but comfortably, creating a space that reflected her own tastes for the first time. She had even adopted a cat from the livery stable, a orange tabby with a crooked tail that Ethan had been feeding for months. Her position in town had changed subtly. No longer the object of whispered pity, she was now respected as a woman of means and independence. She had joined the Ladies' Aid Society and had begun teaching reading to several of the town's children who couldn't attend the school regularly. Ethan was a frequent visitor to her home, always careful to maintain propriety by keeping his calls short and during daylight hours. But as the weeks passed, their connection deepened. They shared books and conversations, meals and memories. Rose found herself looking forward to his visits, missing him when business kept him away for more than a day. On a crisp November evening, with the first serious snow of the season falling gently outside, Ethan arrived at Rose's door with a small package in hand and an unusually nervous expression on his face. "I brought you something," he said, as she welcomed him in from the cold. "An early Christmas gift, I suppose, though that's not really why." He trailed off, and Rose smiled at his uncharacteristic awkwardness. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered, taking his coat and hanging it by the door. "I just made a fresh pot." "Yes, thank you," he replied, following her into the cozy parlor where a fire crackled in the grate and the orange cat dozed on the rug. Rose poured coffee for them both, then sat opposite Ethan, curiosity piqued by the small package he still held. "So this gift," she prompted gently. Ethan cleared his throat, then extended the package to her. "It's not much," he said, "but I saw it and thought of you." Rose unwrapped the brown paper carefully to reveal a small leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a pattern of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the soft leather. "I thought you might use it to write down your thoughts or plans for the future, or—" Ethan paused, seeming to gather his courage before continuing, "or perhaps our story, if you think we might have one." Rose looked up sharply, her heart suddenly racing. "Our story?" Ethan met her gaze steadily, all his usual confidence replaced by a vulnerable honesty that touched her deeply. "Rose, I've grown to care for you more than I can express. I know it's only been a few months since Walter's death, and I understand if you need more time. But I wanted you to know how I feel, and that I'll wait as long as necessary if there's any chance you might someday return those feelings." Rose sat perfectly still, the journal clutched in her hands, emotions swirling through her. Fear, yes, the reflexive terror born from her experience with Walter. But alongside it, something stronger, something that had been growing quietly within her heart during these months of healing. "Ethan," she said softly, "I care for you too, more than I thought I could ever care for anyone again." The hope that blazed in his eyes at her words almost undid her. "But," she continued, needing to be honest, "I'm afraid, not of you, never of you, but of trusting my own judgment, of believing in the possibility of happiness after everything that happened." Ethan nodded, understanding in his expression. "I would never rush you, Rose, and I would never, ever hurt you, but I don't want to presume upon your feelings or your time. If you'd rather I kept my distance—" "No," Rose said quickly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "That's not what I want at all." She placed the journal carefully on the table beside her and rose to her feet, moving to sit beside Ethan on the sofa. "What I want is for us to continue as we have been getting to know each other, building trust, creating memories that have nothing to do with pain or fear." Relief and joy transformed Ethan's face. "I can do that," he said, tentatively reaching for her hand. Rose twined her fingers with his, marveling at how right it felt, how safe. "And perhaps," she added, her voice barely above a whisper, "we might move a little faster than we have been." Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. With exquisite gentleness, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "As you wish, Rose," he murmured. "Always as you wish." Winter settled over Medicine Bow, bringing short days and long, cold nights. Rose's small house became a haven of warmth and light, especially on the evenings when Ethan joined her for dinner or simply to sit by the fire and talk. As Christmas approached, their relationship continued to deepen, each small step forward built on a foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. Their first kiss came on Christmas Eve, after they had attended the service at the small church and returned to Rose's house for hot cider. It was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, but then Rose's arms went around Ethan's neck and his hands found her waist, and the kiss deepened into something that made her heart race and her fears recede. "Merry Christmas, Rose," Ethan whispered when they finally parted, his forehead resting against hers. "Merry Christmas," she replied, marveling at how far she had come in the 6 months since that fateful day in Medicine Bow when a stranger had seen her bruised face and had changed the course of her life forever. As winter gave way to spring, Rose and Ethan's relationship became the subject of approving gossip in town. Though some considered it too soon after Walter's death for Rose to be courting again, most recognized the genuine affection between the couple and were happy to see Rose blossoming under Ethan's respectful attention. By April, Ethan had become a full partner in the livery stable, establishing himself as a permanent part of the Medicine Bow community. He had also begun building a small house on the outskirts of town, on a plot of land with a view of the mountains and ample space for a garden. "It's a good investment," he told Rose when she asked about his plans. "Property in town is only going to become more valuable as the railroad brings more settlers." But they both knew the house represented more than an investment. It was a promise, a hope for the future, a tangible symbol of Ethan's intention to stay. On a warm evening in early June, almost exactly a year after Rose had first encountered Ethan in Henderson's general store, he invited her for a ride to see the progress on the house. The structure was nearly complete now, lacking only interior finishes and furnishings. "What do you think?" Ethan asked as they stood in what would become the parlor, sunlight streaming through the new windows, casting patterns on the unfinished floor. Rose walked slowly through the rooms, imagining them filled with furniture and life. The house was modest but well built, with large windows to capture the light and views, and clever touches that showed Ethan had put careful thought into its design. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You've done an amazing job." Ethan watched her face, his expression a mixture of nervousness and hope. "There's something else I want to show you," he said, leading her to the back of the house. Behind the kitchen was a small room Rose hadn't noticed on previous visits. Ethan opened the door with a flourish, revealing a space lined with empty bookshelves and featuring a wide window seat beneath a bay window. "A library?" Rose asked, delighted. She had often spoken of her love of books and her dream of someday having a proper place to keep them. "I thought it could be," Ethan said, watching her reaction closely. "For your books and any others we might collect over the years, if you'd consider making this your home too." Rose turned to him, her heart suddenly pounding. "Ethan," he took her hands in his blue eyes serious. "Rose Lambert, this past year has been the most meaningful of my life. Getting to know you, watching you reclaim your strength and build a new life, it's been a privilege and a joy." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I love you, Rose." I think I've loved you since that first day in town, when you refused my help but still managed to thank me for offering it." Tears sprang to Rose's eyes, but they were tears of happiness, not sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming easily now, all her earlier fears forgotten in the certainty of her feelings. Ethan's smile was radiant. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "Then, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of making this house our home, of building a life together based on respect and trust and love?" Rose looked into his beloved face, seeing there everything she had once thought forever beyond her reach: safety, partnership, joy. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire that matched his eyes. Then he pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made her feel both cherished and desired. As they stood in the empty room that would become their library, arms wrapped around each other, plans and promises flowing between them as naturally as breathing, Rose thought of how far she had come since that day a year ago. From a woman trapped in a cycle of abuse and fear to a woman standing on the threshold of a new life with a man who saw her true worth, who respected her strength, who loved her not despite her scars, but with full knowledge of all she had survived. Outside, the Wyoming sun painted the distant mountains gold, promising long summer days and warm nights, the season of growth and renewal. Inside, in the circle of Ethan's arms, Rose made a silent vow to never again allow fear to dictate her choices, to build with this good man a marriage based on equality and respect, to cherish every day of the second chance at happiness that had come to her in the most unexpected way. The wedding took place in late September, when the aspen trees turned the mountainsides to gold, and the air held the first crisp hint of the coming winter. It was a small ceremony in the town church, attended by friends from Medicine Bow who had watched the courtship with approval and joy. Rose wore a dress of pale blue silk, specially ordered from Denver, with Margaret's lace veil and a bouquet of late summer wildflowers. Ethan, handsome in a new black suit, waited for her at the altar with such love in his eyes that Rose felt her heart might burst with happiness. "You are so beautiful," he whispered as she joined him before the minister, and Rose knew he wasn't seeing the faint remnants of scars that still marked her face in certain lights, but the woman she had become: strong, loving, whole. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to cherish and respect each other all the days of their lives. When Ethan slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, Rose felt the last shadows of her past finally fade away. The reception was held at their new home, now fully furnished and ready for the newlyweds to begin their life together. Friends brought food and drink, music and laughter filled the rooms, and Rose moved through it all in a haze of joy, her hand rarely leaving Ethan's. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, leaving the couple alone in their home for the first time, Ethan drew Rose into the library he had built for her. The shelves were no longer empty, but filled with books, her small collection augmented by volumes Ethan had ordered as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he said softly, drawing her into his arms. Rose smiled up at him, all her earlier nervousness about the wedding night dissolving in the warmth of his gaze. This was Ethan, who had never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel anything but safe and cherished. "I love you, Mr. Reed," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, Rose discovered that passion without fear was a revelation. Ethan's hands on her body were gentle yet insistent, his kisses both tender and demanding. For the first time, Rose understood that physical love could be a source of joy rather than pain, of connection rather than subjugation. In the quiet aftermath, lying in Ethan's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Rose felt a sense of peace she had never known before. "What are you thinking?" Ethan murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm happy," Rose replied simply. "Truly, completely happy." Ethan tightened his arms around her. "That's all I ever want for you," he said. "All I'll spend my life trying to give you." The years that followed fulfilled that promise. Ethan and Rose built a life together based on mutual respect and deepening love. The livery business prospered, and they eventually expanded into breeding and training horses, developing a reputation throughout the territory for the quality of their stock. Rose found her own path as well, opening a small lending library in one room of their home that eventually grew into Medicine Bow's first bookshop. She took particular pride in helping young women find books that expanded their horizons and encouraged their independence. Their family grew with the birth of their first child, a son they named James, 2 years after their marriage. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 3 years later, and finally another son, Thomas, completed their family. Ethan proved to be as loving and gentle a father as he was a husband, teaching their children by example that strength could be expressed through kindness rather than dominance. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Rose with a trip to Denver, leaving the children in Margaret's capable care. They stayed in a grand hotel, attended the theater, and wandered through bookshops hand in hand like newlyweds. On their last night in the city, over dinner in the hotel's elegant restaurant, Ethan raised his glass to Rose. "To 10 years with the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known," he said, "and to at least 50 more." Rose smiled at him across the table, love welling up in her heart for this man who had saved her in so many ways. "I'll drink to that," she replied, touching her glass to his, "though I think you might be slightly biased in your assessment." "Not at all," Ethan said, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "I'm merely stating facts as I see them." Later that night, as they lay together in the luxurious hotel bed, Rose found herself thinking of the journey that had brought them to this point. From the battered, frightened woman with a swollen face to this, a woman who knew her worth, who was loved completely, who had built a life she could never have imagined in her darkest days. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan murmured, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her face. "I was just thinking how strange life is," Rose said. "How a moment of terrible pain can sometimes lead to unexpected joy." She reached up to touch his beloved face. "If Walter hadn't beaten me that night, if you hadn't seen me in town the next day, I would have found you somehow," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be, Rose." And as he gathered her close, as their bodies joined in the familiar dance of desire and fulfillment, Rose knew he was right. Through all the pain and fear, all the uncertainty and loss, she had found her way to this man, this love, this life. And she was profoundly, endlessly grateful. In the years that followed, as their children grew and the small town of Medicine Bow developed around them, Rose and Ethan remained a beacon of what marriage could be at its best, a partnership of equals, a haven of mutual support, a source of strength rather than constraint. Rose never forgot the woman she had been, or the man who had helped her become who she was meant to be. And on quiet evenings, sitting in the library Ethan had built for her all those years ago, watching him read to their grandchildren with the same gentle attention he gave to everything he valued, she would sometimes touch the faint scars on her face and remember how a single act of courage, his in offering help, hers in eventually accepting it, had changed the course of both their lives. It had been a long journey from that day when her face had been swollen from her husband's rage, when a cowboy had seen her suffering and had decided to end it. But every step of that journey, even the painful ones, had led her here to a life filled with love, respect, and the quiet joy of being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. And that, Rose knew with absolute certainty, was worth everything.